I've always been fascinated by mysteries, especially unsolved mysteries. I think the allure of an unsolved mystery is knowing that the answer is out there somewhere, but for one reason or another, no one has been able to find it. And some famous unsolved mysteries go back centuries. To think that something could happen, and hundreds of years later, people are still left scratching their heads trying to make sense of it, there's something fascinating about that. I decided to celebrate this year's Halloween by going over a few well-known cases of unsolved mysteries. Most of the cases I'll be discussing in this video are definitely stories you've probably heard of before, but I still thought they were interesting and wanted to go over them. I'm going to be covering 6 well-known cases in no particular order. Not only will I give a summary of events that transpired, I'll also go over theories that people put forward and provide my own insight on the cases. With that said, let's begin. From 1888 to 1891, 11 murders were committed in Whitechapel, a district in East London. 5 of these murders, known as the Canonical Five, are commonly attributed to one perpetrator known as Jack the Ripper. The names of the 5 victims are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. There were several pieces of evidence that lead many to believe they were killed by the same person. Not only were all the victims women, they were all prostitutes. They were all mutilated to varying degrees of severity, and all the murders took place within the same general area. There always has been, and possibly always will be, much debate and controversy around the murders, one of the first being whether or not the killer had any anatomical knowledge. Some investigators believe the killer did, as some of the victims were found with missing organs and investigated local medical students. Other investigators believe the opposite, as they felt the manner in which the victims were mutilated was way too brutal to come from an expert. They instead decided to investigate local butchers and slaughtermen, but neither investigation team could find a viable suspect. Speaking of suspects, there is a long list of suspects attributed to the murders. Some of the possible killers were suspected by contemporary police and press, others were listed as suspects by investigators years after the fact. The validity of some of these suspects ranges from plausible unreasonable to what the actual fuck. I do not have anywhere near the time to go over every suspect, but I will go over the 3 most popular suspects, or according to this website I found, they're the 3 most popular. The first suspect is Charles Lechmere. Lechmere actually found the body of Mary Ann Nichols, the first victim. The story goes as such. On August 31st, 1888, at 3:40 a.m., Lechmere was on his way to work when he found Nichols. Another man named Robert Paul came by, and Lechmere showed him the body. Lechmere and Paul then found a police constable named Mizzen and told him about the body. Truth be told, I'm actually surprised that Charles Lechmere is considered a suspect because there isn't any convincing evidence against him. The best thing people put forward are arguments how Lechmere could have been the killer. Lechmere theorists put forward that Lechmere was actually in the middle of killing Nichols when Paul came by and he pretended to find the body to feign innocence. Theorists will point to the fact that there are discrepancies in testimony. For instance, Lechmere said he was still in the middle of the road when Paul came in, but Paul said that Lechmere was close to the body when he came in. Lechmere also supposedly lied to Mizzen about there being another police constable at the crime scene. Mizzen quoted Lechmere saying, "You are wanted in Bucks Row by policemen. A woman is lying there." However, some newspapers quoted Lechmere saying, "You are wanted down there." He said this as he pointed to the crime scene. There's also the fact that Lechmere used a different name when talking to police. Charles was born to the parents with the surname Lechmere, but his father died and his mother remarried to a policeman with the surname Cross. But Charles still went by Lechmere regardless. When talking to police, Charles referred to himself as Cross, with theorists reasoning that he wouldn't do this unless he had something to hide. Also consider the fact that Lechmere's route to work passed through most of the murder sites, and his job as a meat deliverer would have left him covered in blood. Lechmere could have used this as an excuse if he was covered with the blood of his victims. All of this seems pretty compelling at first, but the theory has its logical holes. First, when it comes to the discrepancies in the testimony, this can be easily attributed to faulty memory. Eyewitness testimony is notorious for these kind of problems because, surprise, people don't have perfect memories. And while it is true that most of the murder sites pass by Lechmere's route to work, this isn't the case for Elizabeth Stride, the third victim. Lechmere theorists respond to this by either striking Stride's name from the victims list. What is mental gymnastics?
That's right.
Or they'll point out that Lechmere's mother lived by Stride's murder site, meaning that Lechmere could have killed her on his way to or returning from a visit with his mother. Which, sure, it's possible he could have, but as far as I know, there's no evidence that Lechmere visited his mother around the time of Stride's murder. And while it could have been convenient for Lechmere to use his job as an excuse for his victim's bloodstains, he couldn't use that excuse for the first victim as he found Nicholas's body on his way to work. I'm not entirely sure whether Lechmere was covered with Nicholas's blood or not, but let's assume for the sake of argument that he was, and let's also assume that he was the killer. How would he have covered for that? The only thing I will concede is that it's suspicious how Lechmere used a different last name when talking to police. I think this is a good reason to be suspicious of Lechmere, but it isn't enough to directly link him to the murders. I don't find the Lechmere theory very convincing. There isn't enough solid evidence, and the only thing Lechmere theorists can provide is, well, he might have been the Ripper, which, sure, he could have been, but I don't see any good reason to see him as a viable suspect. The next suspect is Francis Tumblety, who had a notorious reputation for being a quack doctor. In 1857, Tumblety was prosecuted for practicing medicine without a license and was charged for manslaughter in 1860 when a patient died under his care. Tumblety was named as a suspect in the murders by Inspector John Littlechild in 1913 in a letter he wrote to journalist John Sims. Tumblety was arrested on November 7, 1888 for unnatural offenses, and by that they meant he was gay. Tumblety was incarcerated for a few days, but made bail on November 16th. Tumblety was spotted in France on November 23rd and then boarded a boat en route to New York City the next day. Tumblety was suspected of the murders after the death of Mary Kelly, but Tumblety was in New York City during the murder of Alice Mackenzie in Whitechapel in the summer of 1889. While Mackenzie is not part of the Canonical Five, police at the time believed her to be one of the Ripper's victims, and Tumblety was taken off the suspects list, but he was added back on the list later on. Dr. William Eckert and Dr. Brent Turvey both investigated the murders in 1989 and came to the conclusion that the murders were not sexually motivated, but were motivated by anger and misogyny. If this is the case, then that would implicate Tumblety. As Littlechild wrote to Sims, Tumblety had a reputation as a misogynist, and it's reported that he talked to others about how much he hated women and blamed them for society's ills. Tumblety also had an alleged collection of uteri from women, which is significant as one of the victims was found with a missing uterus. However, this claim should be taken with a grain of salt, as there's no evidence that such a collection existed, and the man who reported the collection, C.S. Dunham, is considered an unreliable witness and also had a reputation as a trickster. Also, the case against Tumblety has been described as a, quote, fairly weak one, and for good reason. There is no evidence that Tumblety was ever at Whitechapel, and even if he was, he didn't match the descriptions of the killer's face provided by witnesses. There was also no evidence that Tumblety was violent, and while he was a suspect after the murder of Kelly, this is only by 3 officers. At large, the police didn't consider him a suspect. And when you remember the timeline from earlier, the idea of Tumblety being the Ripper falls apart as he didn't make bail until November 16th, 7 days after the murder of Kelly. Kind of hard to carry out a murder under those circumstances. Just like Lechmere, I find myself being unconvinced of Tumblety's guilt. The arguments put forward aren't enough to tie him to the murders. When it comes to the last suspect, Aaron Kaminsky, things are a little different. Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson was adamant that Kaminsky was the killer, but doing the reading myself, it seems that anti-Semitism played a role in his suspicions. Anderson was quoted as describing the killer as a, quote, low-class Jew, and claimed that the other Jews in the area knew Kaminsky was the killer, but refused to give him up to, quote, Gentile justice. That's a yikes. The reason Kaminsky gets talked about a lot when it comes to the case is because of a fairly recent breakthrough. In 2007, a man named Russell Edwards bought a shawl that allegedly belonged to the 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes. Edwards then approached Dr. Jerry Lowenlane, who has been described as a, quote, expert in genetic evidence from historic crime scenes. Lolane was asked to examine the shawl, and the testing started in 2011. Lolane determined that there were bloodstains on the shawl that was consistent with blood spatter caused by slashing, which would match with the killer's MO. Lolane also found semen stains on the shawl. Gross. Lolane conducted a DNA test where he compared DNA from the shawl to the DNA from descendants of Eddowes and Kaminsky, and both samples were a match. Edwards and Lolane declared that Kaminsky was the killer and called it a closed case. This seems pretty definitive, but there was some pushback. Lolane said he identified the DNA by looking at a mutation that he identified as 314.1C, which apparently has a 1 in 290,000 chance of showing up in someone. However, experts claimed that the mutation was incorrectly identified by Lolane. Instead of 314.1C, the mutation should have been identified as 315.1C, which is far more common. The article I read claimed it was present in, quote, more than 99% of people of European descent. Another point of contention is that Lolane used mitochondrial DNA in the test. Lolane couldn't use genomic DNA because it would have fragmented after so long, but mitochondrial DNA could be used as it survived much better. The thing about mitochondrial DNA is that it can be shared by thousands of people, meaning it's possible the DNA found on the shawl didn't belong to Eddowes and Kaminsky, but rather belonged to people who shared the mitochondrial DNA. There is also some doubt as to whether the shawl actually belonged to Eddowes, as not only is there no evidence of her ownership, it's also suspected she wouldn't have been able to afford it as she was in poverty at the time of her murder. There's also an inconsistency I noticed when doing research. Dr. William Eckert and Dr. Brent Turvey both claimed that the murders were not sexually motivated, but Lolane found semen stains on the shawl, which raises further questions and opens the door to more debate. Were the murders sexually motivated, or were they motivated by misogyny? When it comes to these three suspects, I find myself of the opinion that Aaron Kaminsky is the most likely candidate. Now, keep in mind, the full suspect list is pretty lengthy, and I didn't do that much reading on most of it. It's likely that if I were to research every single Jack the Ripper suspect, then I would find a more fitting candidate than Kaminsky, but my opinion stands for the time being. I don't find the evidence against Lechmere and Tumblety convincing, as most of it isn't definitive and most of the arguments are circumstantial. Kaminsky, on the other hand, has a DNA test linking him to the crime. Granted, the findings of the DNA test should be taken with a grain of salt, but it's better than the alternatives. And even though there are genuine issues to be taken with the findings of the test, it hasn't been definitively debunked. At least, not yet. I'm not saying that Aaron Kaminsky was, without a shadow of a doubt, Jack the Ripper, but I am saying he seems like the most likely candidate. It's possible that Kaminsky wasn't the killer and the true identity of Jack the Ripper has yet to be actually discovered. We may never actually know who Jack the Ripper was, unless, someone invented a time machine, went back in time, and caught the killer in the act. But until that happens, the Jack the Ripper case remains open. The Mary Celeste was a ship built in Nova Scotia in 1861. She originally went by the name Amazon, but was given the name Mary Celeste by Richard Haynes in 1868. The Mary Celeste would have quite an unlucky career. One story I saw come up a bit in my research was how the ship's first captain, Robert McLean, died on her maiden voyage. But the story most famously associated with the Mary Celeste took place in 1872. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste set off from New York City en route to Italy. The ship was carrying a crew of 8 with the captain's wife and daughter also on board. The ship was carrying 1,700 barrels of alcohol that would be dropped off in Italy. However, the Mary Celeste didn't arrive when it should have. On December 5, 1872, the Dei Gratia was at sea when her crew spotted the Mary Celeste. They saw the Mary Celeste in an unusual state. Her sails were in poor condition, she was drifting, and they couldn't see anyone on board. The captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, sent 3 of his crewmen to investigate. The 3 crewmen saw that the Mary Celeste's crew's possessions were still on board, the lifeboat was missing, one of the pumps was disassembled, and there were 3.5 feet of water in the bottom of the ship. But they didn't find anyone else. Apart from the 3 crewmen of the Dei Gratia, the Mary Celeste at that moment was completely devoid of human life. The crew of the Dei Gratia took over the Mary Celeste and sailed her to Gibraltar. The Dei Gracia crew were hoping to salvage the ship, but the inquiry was suspicious of the Dei Gracia crew and launched an investigation, but they found no evidence of foul play. The Dei Gracia's crew would continue the Mary Celeste trip to Italy. Afterwards, the ship would continue to sail for 13 more years. In 1885, the Mary Celeste would fall under the command of Captain G.C. Parker, who deliberately crashed the Mary Celeste in an attempted insurance fraud. Parker failed to sink the ship, and so did his scheme. Despite this, the Mary Celeste was damaged beyond repair, so she was left to rot at her crash site. The story of the Mary Celeste crew going missing was popularized in 1884 thanks to a novel written by Arthur Conan Doyle, the same author best known for the Sherlock Holmes series. Doyle's novel, J. Hapuck Jepson's Statement, was based on the story of the Mary Celeste and told the story of an ex-slave on board who kills the crew. Ever since the publication of the book, many theories were put forward in an attempt to explain the fate of the Mary Celeste crew. While Doyle's book popularized the story, it also arguably was the start of a problem with over-sensationalism with the Mary Celeste story. There are common misconceptions that a cat was found on board and that the crew's half-eaten breakfast was also found, neither of which are true, but that isn't even the worst of it. There's a conspiracy theory that the crew of the Dei Gracia attacked and killed the crew of the Mary Celeste and only pretended to find the abandoned ship, which doesn't make any sense as the Dei Gracia was slower than the Mary Celeste, and the Dei Gracia was 8 days behind the Mary Celeste when Dei Gracia set sail, so there's no way an ambush could have taken place. Another conspiracy theory suggests the captains of the Mary Celeste and the Dei Gracia conspired a disappearance in an insurance fraud scheme. This theory claims the cargo was overinsured, which isn't true. To quote the article I read, there is no reason to commit fraud. There are even theories that the crew was taken by aliens or a sea monster. Do I even need to entertain those theories? Going back to the realm of reality, some theories are more violent in nature, such as mutiny, murder, or piracy. The problem with these theories is that there was no evidence of struggle found on board. Granted, the Dei Gracia crew did find a sword, and it was believed that the sword was covered in blood, but the bloodstains was actually just rust. Also, none of the possessions or cargo on the Mary Celeste was missing, ruling out piracy as a possibility. So, what happened? It's most likely that the crew of the Mary Celeste abandoned ship under the impression that their lives were in danger. There are two common theories that lead to this conclusion. First is the theory that the crew abandoned ship believing it was going to sink. Remember that the Mary Celeste was found with 3.5 feet of water at the bottom. There's also a disassembled pump found as well as a dowsing rod. All this could be evidence that the crew falsely believed the Mary Celeste was going to sink, so abandoned ship. The second possibility points to the barrels of alcohol on board. If not properly ventilated, alcohol could build up in fumes. 9 of the barrels on board were found empty, leading to the possibility that noxious fumes leaked, leading to the ship being abandoned. While both of these theories are the most likely, both aren't without their critics and flaws. When it comes to the sinking theory, there wasn't that much water found in the Mary Celeste, so even if the crew believed they were in danger of sinking at first, they quickly would have realized the ship wasn't actually sinking. As for the alcohol fumes theory, none of the Dei Gracia crew who investigated the Mary Celeste reported smelling alcohol fumes while on board. And 9 empty barrels were found, but this could be attributed to the fact that the empty barrels were made of red oak, which the article described as a porous wood, meaning it's more likely to leak. A more extreme version of the fumes theory proposes that there was an explosion on board which prompted the crew to abandon ship, but no evidence of an explosion was found. That being said, I did find an article that references an experiment conducted by Dr. Andrea Sella. Sella built a replica of the Mary Celeste's cargo hold, used paper cubes in place of wooden barrels, and filled it with butane gas, simulating an explosion caused by alcohol fumes. What she found is that the explosion didn't leave any traces, apparently due to cool air behind the flames. That being said, while the experiment proves that an explosion could have taken place on the Mary Celeste without leaving a trace, the experiment didn't prove that it did happen. Not to mention that Scylla puts forward the idea that an explosion blew the hatches off the cargo lid, which is a common idea put forward by explosion theorists, but the hatch wasn't found in such a state by the Dei Gracia crew. With all of that said, I do find the sinking and fumes theory to be the most convincing. Granted, they're not perfect, and when it comes to the fumes theory, I'm not convinced an explosion took place, but the crew could have been under the impression that they were in danger regardless. I don't believe the crew was attacked, but rather abandoned ship, believing their lives were in danger. The crew and their missing lifeboat were never found, and even if it was, there still would be a lot of unanswered questions. Assuming tomorrow we found the lifeboat with all deceased crew members inside, it would confirm that they did abandon ship, but we probably wouldn't know why they abandoned ship. This hypothetical discovery would be a massive lead for the case, but it wouldn't bring it to a definitive end. In August 1587, an English colony was founded on an island near North Carolina called Roanoke. The colony was founded by Walter Raleigh and governed by John White. White's pregnant daughter, Eleanor White, was one of the colonists and gave birth to a daughter named Virginia on August 18, 1587. Later that year, White had to return to England to gather supplies for the colony. The colonists had been discussing moving inland, so White gave them instructions before his departure. If the colonists leave during White's absence, then they are to write down their destination. If they leave in the event of an emergency, they are to leave a cross on their message. White arrived in England in November. He would have returned to Roanoke immediately, however, a war broke out between England and Spain. Queen Elizabeth prohibited English ships from leaving the country, grounding White on the opposite side of the Atlantic for 3 years. It wasn't until the summer of 1590 when White finally returned, but what he found was odd. White led an expedition on 2 ships, Hopewell and Moonlight. Both ships landed on Croatoan Island on August 12th, and 3 days later, the crews of the ships saw smoke coming from Roanoke Island. White assembled a landing party, and they spent the next 2 days making their way to the north end of Roanoke. They made landfall on August 18th. They found fresh tracks in the sand, but they didn't find whoever left them. When they arrived at the colony site, they found that it had been fortified in White's absence. They could not, however, find the colonists. The houses had been dismantled, objects that could have been carried away were missing, trunks had been looted, and no boats were found on shore. The only clue the landing party found was the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post. John White was confident in the meaning behind the carving. Remember that White instructed the colonists to write down their location if they were to leave, and as there was no cross found with the carving, it can be fairly reasoned that the colonists moved to Croatoan, but not under a state of emergency. White's landing party returned to the Hopewell. They all planned to visit Croatoan the next day, but one of the Hopewell's anchor cables snapped. This put the ship at risk of wrecking, so the crew decided to spend winter in the Caribbean and make their way to Croatoan the next year. This never happened as a storm blew the Hopewell off course. The crew was forced to stop at the Azores, but wind conditions made landfall impossible. The only choice the crew had was to return to England. White never managed to land on Croatoan and reunite with the colonists and his family. In the following years, investigations were launched to find the lost colonists, but all came up empty-handed. In 1607, Jamestown was established. The Jamestown colonists made their own attempt to find the Roanoke colonists, which led to them hearing reports from Native Americans claiming there were Europeans living in the area. It was suspected that natives were referring to the Roanoke colonists, but they were never found. The centuries went by and nothing came of the mystery. That would change in 1937 when a man named Lewis Hammond arrived at Atlanta's Emory University with a stone with writing on it. Hammond claimed to find it that summer in North Carolina and hoped the experts at the university could decipher the writings on it. The folks at the university were able to translate the writing, which said, "Annius Dare in Virginia went hence unto heaven" in 1591. The stone also had instructions to show it to John White and was signed EWD, the initials for Eleanor White Dare. This stone was a supposed piece of evidence linked to the Roanoke colonists. The researchers worked to determine the authenticity of the stones, but their efforts were inconclusive, so one of the researchers, Haywood Jefferson Pierce Jr., sold the stone to his father, and the two of them put out a $500 reward for anyone that could find more Dare stones. The two would receive more stones from strangers over the years, and by 1940, they had a total of 48 stones, 42 of which came from one man, Bill Eberhart, a stonemason from Georgia. All the stones supposedly belonged to Eleanor, and they told the story of how the colonists relocated inland shortly after White's departure, only for over half of them to die to disease, and some of the survivors were killed by natives. The stones also claimed that the colonists assimilated with Cherokee. Eleanor married a chief and had a daughter named Agnes. The authenticity of the stones couldn't be verified, and it wasn't suspected that Eberhard faked the stones, as it was believed he didn't have the expertise to do so. But all of that would eventually change. In December 1940, the Saturday Evening Post tasked journalist Boyden Sparks to investigate the stones. He did some digging and presented his findings the following year. Sparks found that Eberhard had a history of faking Native American artifacts, and that two of the people who claimed to discover the stones, William Bruce and Isaac Turner, had been friends with Eberhard for years. These two facts, as well as many others uncovered by Eberhard, made it pretty clear that the stones were fake. The same, however, can't be said for the first stone. Even though the Hammond stone has never been definitively debunked, its authenticity hasn't been verified either. Nobody who analyzed the stone could find definitive proof of a forgery, but the convenient timing of the stone's discovery has been pointed out. Hammond found the stone in 1939, which was the year of Virginia Dare's 350th birthday, and because of this, the mystery gained a resurgent popularity. Bit of a coincidence, don't you think? Let's fast forward 72 years to 2012. Researchers were examining a map painted by John White called Virginia. On it, they found two forts painted in invisible ink located 50 miles west of Roanoke, the same distance the colonists planned to move before White's departure. In 2015, a team of archaeologists working for the First Colony Foundation visited the site on the map and dubbed it Site X. No fort was found, but the team did find shards of European pottery. The search continued in December 2019 at another site, Site Y, where they found European ceramic fragments. The archaeologists did consider the possibility that the artifacts came from Jamestown, but this was dismissed as there were no English pipes found, which were considered ubiquitous with the settlement. They were confident the artifacts came from the Roanoke colonists, but their findings did receive some pushback. An archaeologist named Charles Eilean criticized the First Company Foundation, saying, quote, "They are looking to prove rather than seeking to disprove their theory, which is the scientific way." It's also been said that the colonists would not have gone to that location as it was in the heart of enemy territory, and archaeologists have found artifacts at Croatoan Island, which is modern-day Hatteras Island, that strongly suggest English presence, and some have boldly claimed that this proves the colonists went there instead. Some people have put forward the idea that both are true, meaning that the colonists broke into two groups, one going to Croatoan and the other going inland. A problem with this theory arises when you consider that White and his landing party only found a carving of the word Croatoan, but no such carving indicating the colonists move inland. If the colonists did split up into two groups, then why didn't they leave behind such a clue for White? The only explanation I can think of is the possibility that the colonists split up into two groups after they departed Roanoke, but there's no way to know for sure that's what happened. All of this, and there's still the question of what happened to the colonists. There are theories that the colonists were attacked by Native Americans or Spaniards, or they were wiped out by disease or famine. The problem with these theories is that no human remains were found at Roanoke, ruling these out as possibilities. I'm convinced the colonists most likely went to Croatoan and possibly lived among friendly natives, but their fate afterwards I'm less certain about. Perhaps had fate not been so cruel and White was allowed to visit Croatoan in 1590, the day after returning to Roanoke, maybe he could have reunited with the colonists and his family and gotten the answers he wanted. But of course, this is assuming they went to Croatoan in the first place. Regardless, there has to be some definitive evidence of the colonists' whereabouts somewhere, and it kind of baffles me that we haven't been able to find any 433 years after the disappearance of the colonists. On December 26, 1900, a ship by the name Hesperus arrived at Eilean Island. The captain of the ship, James Harvey, planned to drop off supplies, and Joseph Moore, who would be replacing one of the lighthouse keepers on the island. However, when the Hesperus approached the island, Captain Harvey noticed something odd. The three keepers already on the island, Thomas Marshall, James DeCat, and William MacArthur, should have been outside waiting for the ship's arrival, but they were nowhere to be seen. Harvey blew the ship's horn and even fired a flare, but there was no response. Harvey sent Moore on the island to investigate, and when he arrived at the lighthouse, it became clear that something was wrong. The front door was unlocked, and two of the three oilskin coats were missing. There are reports that Moore found half-eaten food, an overturned chair, and a stopped clock in the kitchen. However, these details of the story have been called into question. Regardless, Moore searched the rest of the house, but couldn't find the keepers. Moore returned to the ship and informed Captain Harvey, who ordered a search of the whole island, but the crew couldn't find any sign of the 3 keepers. Harvey then sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board, and a few days later, a member of the board, Robert Muirhead, went to the island to investigate. Muirhead found the lighthouse log and read through it, and what he found was odd. On December 12th, Thomas Marshall wrote of severe winds and noted that James Ducat was quiet and Amelia MacArthur was crying. What's odd about this is that MacArthur had a reputation as a tough guy, and crying was out of character for him. The log would continue to tell of the storm, with an entry dated December 13th stating the keepers were praying, which is odd because they were experienced lighthouse keepers who were safe inside a sturdy building. The last log entry was dated December 15th and read as such: "Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all." Muirhead then went down to the island's landing platform, where he found rope strewn about that was normally in a supply crane positioned 70 feet above the platform. The conclusion Muirhead came to was that the 3 men left the lighthouse and made their way to the platform in an attempt to secure supplies, presumably a life buoy, and were washed out to sea by a rogue wave. Muirhead would write this theory in his official report, but not everyone was convinced. Many asked why the bodies hadn't washed ashore and why 3 experienced lighthouse keepers would allow themselves to be taken by a rogue wave. Despite this, the rogue wave theory persisted through the years and is one of the most common explanations given for their disappearance. Of course, there have been fantastical theories put forward, like the lighthouse keepers being abducted by pirates, or spies, or, of course, aliens. A more plausible explanation put forward is that a fight broke out between the 3 men. MacArthur had a reputation for being a brawler, leading some to suspect that he got into a fight with Marshall and Ducat, which ended with them falling off the platform and into the sea. But even assuming the wave theory or the fight theory are accurate, there are still a few unanswered questions. Why did the 3 men leave the lighthouse even though it was prohibited? Why did one of the men not take a coat with him even though it was winter? But the biggest puzzle of them all is the storm written about in the logs. The lighthouse logs found by Muirhead wrote of a storm between December 12th and December 15th, but the problem is there was no storm recorded on the island between the 12th and 15th. A storm did start on the island, but not until the 17th. I suppose that there is a possibility that the keepers had their dates off, and Thomas Marshall started writing on the 17th, believing it was the 12th. However, we're talking about a 5-day gap. Being off by 1 or 2 days is one thing, but 5 days is a bit much. Personally, I agree with Muirhead when he said the lighthouse keepers left in an attempt to secure supplies on the landing platform and fell into the ocean, whether it was due to a rogue wave or a brawl. There are still some questions left by this bizarre story, but unfortunately, we'll never get any satisfactory answers. On November 24th, 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper boarded Flight 305 of Northwest Orient Airlines. After the plane took off, Cooper handed a note to a stewardess claiming to have a bomb on board and asked her to sit with him. The stewardess sat next to Cooper and he opened a briefcase for her. Inside were sticks of dynamite. The stewardess showed the note to the captain, who proceeded to contact Air Control to inform them of the situation. Air Control then contacted Seattle Police, who then contacted the FBI. Cooper was holding the plane hostage and threatened to blow it up unless his demands weren't met. He asked for $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes and asked for them to be delivered at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. The flight landed in Seattle, where Cooper exchanged the flight's passengers for money and parachutes. Cooper asked for bills with random serial numbers, and while the FBI complied with this demand, they at least gave Cooper's bills marked with serial numbers starting with the letter L. After Cooper acquired his money and parachutes, the plane took off again en route to New Mexico. Cooper asked for the plane to fly below 10,000 feet and to keep the airspeed no faster than 150 knots. Cooper also asked for the cabin to be depressurized. Cooper's original plan was to go to Mexico City, but the pilot said it would be impossible with Cooper's specified altitude and speed, so it was decided to stop in Reno, Nevada for refueling. The flight took off from Seattle at 7:56 p.m., after which Cooper ordered the crew to stay in the cockpit. At 8 p.m., a red light came on in the cockpit, warning that a cabin door is open. The captain asked Cooper if he needed help, but Cooper angrily dismissed him. At 8:24 p.m., the plane dipped when it was 25 miles north of Portland near the Lewis River. The crew suspected that Cooper jumped, but didn't dare check out of fear of angering him, so they continued with the flight. It wasn't until 10:15 p.m. when the plane landed in Reno that the crew saw that Cooper, the money, and 3 of the parachutes were gone. The FBI investigated the hijacking and tried to find Cooper. The police searched criminal records for Dan Cooper, but came out empty-handed. They did find a D.B. Cooper, but quickly dismissed him as a suspect. Despite this, a press member mistakenly reported D.B. Cooper as the hijacker's alias, which is how most people remember him today. In November of 1971, the police conducted a search of the area where Cooper landed, but no sign of the money, parachutes, or Cooper was found. That wasn't until February 10, 1980, when a little boy found bundles of $20 bills in the Columbia River. The authorities checked the bills, and sure enough, the serial numbers matched the numbers on Cooper's bills. 5 years after the hijacking, the FBI had over 800 suspects, but only 24 were removed from the list. The FBI would continue to search for Cooper over the years, but officially closed the case in the summer of 2016. There are a wide range of theories and suspects tied to D.B. Cooper, and I obviously don't have any of the time to go over all of it, but I can discuss the very legitimate theory that Tommy Wiseau is D.B. Cooper. You heard that right. Tommy Wiseau, the writer, director, producer, and star of the 2003 movie The Room, which is often regarded as one of the worst movies ever made, is the infamous D.B. Cooper. The evidence is undeniable. Tommy Wiseau has a large sum of money, and no one knows how he got it. Cooper's exact age was unknown, while Wiseau's colleagues say he's older than he says. Tommy Wiseau has a unique, undiscernible accent, and it's suspected that D.B. Cooper wasn't American, as he used the phrase negotiable American currency in his note. And not to mention, Wiseau is kind of similar to the police sketches of Cooper. The D.B. Cooper mystery has finally been solved, except it hasn't. The Tommy Wiseau theory is just people having fun, and no one actually believes that Tommy Wiseau is D.B. Cooper. So, why bring it up? Because I love The Room, and I thought that this theory was really funny, so I wanted to bring it up. As for the more serious suspects, it's impossible for me to go over every single one, but there is one compelling suspect that I came across in my research, that is Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. The reason McCoy is suspected as being Cooper is because he carried out an airplane hijacking in 1972 that's remarkably similar to the Cooper hijacking. McCoy boarded Flight 855 en route from Newark to LA. McCoy brought a hand grenade and gun on board, as well as an envelope filled with instructions. McCoy asked for $500,000 and 4 parachutes. The plane landed at an airport, and the crew were set free in exchange for McCoy's money and parachutes, and he ordered the crew into the cockpit. McCoy instructed the crew to go into the cockpit and asked the captain to fly at 16,000 feet and 200 miles per hour. In the final comparison, McCoy jumped out of the plane with his ransom money. The FBI investigated McCoy's hijacking and were tipped off by an acquaintance of McCoy. McCoy was a Vietnam War vet, helicopter pilot, and a skydiver, and had financial issues. McCoy's history gave him the expertise to carry out the hijacking, while his money problems gave him the motivation to do so. McCoy was arrested in April 1972 and sentenced 2 months later. McCoy escaped from prison in April 1974, only to be killed by FBI agents in November that year. McCoy is a likely suspect and was even considered by the FBI, but the FBI eventually took McCoy off the suspect list because, get this, he was deemed to be too competent to be D.B. Cooper. Wow. Many people believe McCoy was Cooper, but just as many are convinced. For one, McCoy didn't match Cooper's physical description, and witnesses to the Cooper hijacking insisted that McCoy wasn't the perpetrator. Not to mention, McCoy's demeanor differed from Cooper's. The police searched McCoy's home for evidence against him for his own hijacking, but they couldn't find any evidence linking him to Cooper, and none of the fingerprints collected by authorities matched between Cooper and McCoy. McCoy's family did claim he was D.B. Cooper, but the same was said by friends and families of countless Cooper suspects, so this isn't really anything special. Not to mention, McCoy's family never substantiated their claims with any evidence. Many believe that Cooper died during his skydive due to unideal skydiving conditions, specifically the cold winter weather and the fact that Cooper was wearing a suit at the time. There's also the possibility that Cooper used a faulty chute when he jumped, and Cooper's money was found in a river, which is often used as evidence by those who believe Cooper died. Personally, I'm not certain whether or not Cooper survived the jump. It's possible that he died, but it's also possible that he survived and his body was never found. Either way, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. Who was D.B. Cooper? Why did he hijack the plane? What did he want or need the money for? Did he survive the skydive? The Cooper hijacking is to date the only unsolved plane hijacking in America, and who knows if or when that will change. In the mid-80s, Rocky Morton created a character named Max Headroom, who debuted to the world in the 1985 movie Max Headroom 20 Minutes into the Future. Played by actor Matt Frewer, the Max Headroom character was an artificial intelligence who lived in a post-apocalyptic world and acted like a TV host, using his position to share information to fight against evil corporations. Max Headroom would go on to get his own TV series in 1987 and become a popular character, even making advertisements for Coca-Cola at the time. However, the Max Headroom character would go on to be associated with what is now known as the Max Headroom Incident. On November 22, 1987, at 9:14 p.m., Chicagoans were watching a football game between the Bears and Lions when suddenly the signal was hijacked and they saw this. But that wouldn't be the last time that night viewers would see the fake Max Headroom. At 11:15 p.m., PBS affiliate WWTW aired a rerun of the Doctor Who episode The Horror of Fang Rock, and the second hijacking took place.
Some dry
Someone dressed as Max Headroom interrupted the football game.
Their giant masterpiece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds. My brother is wearing the other one. But it's naughty. I thought you got footprints on. They're coming to get me.
This was the second and last time viewers would witness this character hijacking their regularly scheduled programming. The FCC and FBI investigated the hijacking, but were unsuccessful in finding the culprit. They did find, however, that the hijacking was achieved by the perpetrator placing their dish antenna between the transmitter tower. They also came to the conclusion that the metallic background featured in the hijacking videos was a roll-down door often seen in warehouses. The investigators looked into this lead, but came up empty-handed. Even though the investigators failed to find the culprit, they did come to the conclusion that the hijacker was a local who held a grudge against WGN-TV based on the hijacker's comments and actions in the hijacking videos. The hijacker shouted out Chuck Swirsky, a sports pundit who worked for WGN, who the hijacker called a freaking liberal, and the hijacker even claimed, "I'm better than him." The hijacker also said the phrase, "the greatest newspaper nerds," which is a reference to the Chicago Tribune, a sister paper to WGN, who were called the world's greatest newspaper. The hijacker's decision to dress like Max Headroom seems to be deliberate, as at one point in the second hijacking, he picked up a Pepsi can, said, "Catch the wave," then threw the can. This was a reference to Max Headroom advertising Coca-Cola, which at the time had the slogan, "Catch the wave." And let's not forget that the Max Headroom character would use information to battle evil corporations. It's possible that the hijacker dressed up as Max Headroom because he believed he was doing the same with the hijackings. Despite how compelling this information is, the culprit was still never found. There have been suspects though, and one name that often comes up is Eric Foreigner. Around the time of the hijackings, Foreigner was a member of local punk rock bands such as the Blood Farmers. Foreigner left the band in the mid-90s and went on to create a character named Shay St. John. Foreigner would upload videos featuring Shay St. John online in the early 2000s, and it's these videos that people point to as evidence that Foreigner was the hijacker, with the belief that Foreigner's work with the Shay St. John character was similar to the Max Headroom hijacking videos. It's believed that Foreigner's band, Blood Farmers, had acquired TV station equipment and wanted to hijack Chicago Airlines to play one of their music videos. However, they realized that doing so would easily incriminate them, so they decided to do something else instead. This narrative puts forward that Foreigner took control of the project, making both videos and carrying out the hijacking. The evidence against Foreigner isn't all that compelling, but regardless, one of Foreigner's old colleagues, Harry Bergen, dismissed the theory entirely. According to Bergen, Foreigner didn't know anything about video editing at the time, their band never made a music video, they didn't know anyone with any expertise in mass communication and or had broadcasting equipment, and the only time their band went to Chicago was for a Pixies concert. Foreigner is unable to comment on this theory as he unfortunately passed away in 2010. The same year Foreigner passed away, a Reddit user with the name u/bpogue submitted a post to the IAMA subreddit, saying, "I believe I know who was behind the Max Headroom incident." Unfortunately, the post had been removed by the moderators of that subreddit, so thanks for that. I was able to find a summary elsewhere, but still, what the hell, guys? In their post, bpogue discussed knowing two brothers, J and K, who were involved with the hacking community in the 80s and 90s. bpogue recalled one time meeting with J and K in K's apartment. K lived with his girlfriend and another hijacker, and bpogue said that the room was covered with computer equipment. bpogue overheard a conversation between everyone, saying that J had something big planned for that weekend. The group made their way to a local Pizza Hut, where bpogue asked them what they meant by big, and they replied by saying, "Just watch Channel 11 later tonight." bpogue did watch the hijacking later that night, but by that time, he had forgotten about the conversation and didn't put two and two together until later. bpogue would come to believe that J and K were the hijackers, and that J was the man behind the Max Headroom mask. bpogue said that J had a sense of humor that he described as, quote, sort of disgusting, sort of sexually deviant in nature. This is consistent with the hijacking, as the fake Max Headroom held up a phallic object and his bare butt is swatted by a woman in a maid outfit. bpogue also said that J had a tendency to, quote, jump around randomly back and forth to different subjects when he talked, which certainly matches up with what the hijacker did in the video, going from quoting lyrics from a Temptation song, to humming the Clutch Cargo theme song, to wearing a gardening glove and talking about how his brother was wearing the other one. All this leads bpogue to believing that J was dressed as Max Headroom, K was the cameraman, and K's girlfriend was the one who held the fly swatter. All of that being said, bpogue did admit that all his evidence was circumstantial, and in 2015, he would make an update that changed their perspective on J and K. bpogue got in touch with Rick Klein, the curator of the Museum of Classic Chicago Television. The two of them reached out to engineers and technicians who worked in the industry and lived in Chicago at the time of the hijacking. bpogue and Klein gathered insight from these individuals and came to the conclusion that the chances the hijackings were carried out by an outsider was, quote, basically zero. The equipment an amateur would have needed to carry out the hijacking didn't exist in the wild in 1987. bpogue believes this clears J and K of all suspicion. Obviously, I can't read the original Reddit post anymore, but based off the pieces I've seen of it, I don't have any reason to doubt OP's story. There are no red flags that give away that it's all made up, seeing as how bpogue admitted that the evidence he put forward was circumstantial, and even updated the post 5 years later that exonerated J and K as suspects, both of which I wouldn't expect from someone faking a story like this. Even though I don't have any reason to doubt bpogue's authenticity, we should still consider the fact that this is a Reddit post, so by its very nature, it should be taken with a grain of salt. With all that said, the conclusion I reached about the Max Headroom incident is that it was most likely an inside job. The hijacker probably held a grudge against WGN-TV and deliberately dressed as Max Headroom and is possibly inspired by the character. But even then, we can't be absolutely sure how or why the hijacking occurred unless we find the perpetrator. Unless the hijacker comes forward with evidence or they're exposed by someone else, we may never know who is responsible for the Max Headroom incident. Although some of the research for this video was tedious, I did find it quite enjoyable. I learned a lot during the research phase, not just about the individual cases themselves, but about the culture around unsolved mysteries as a whole. I did notice a few reoccurring patterns of reading over the cases. For instance, I did notice quite a bit of supernatural or equally as ridiculous theories being put forward. Everything from Lewis Carroll being Jack the Ripper, aliens abducting the crew of the Mary Celeste, to giant birds abducting the Eilean Lighthouse keepers. A less unfortunate pattern I noticed is that nothing is ever quite as it seems. There were a few moments when I felt like maybe some kind of definitive answer was found for one of the cases, only to do more reading and find that even the most plausible explanations were shrouded in doubt. For example, I discussed how I felt that Aaron Kaminsky was the most likely Jack the Ripper suspect due to the DNA evidence, but I also conceded that there's good reason to take this evidence with a grain of salt. Similarly with the Roanoke colonist mystery, all the evidence suggests the colonists went to Croatoan, but this is yet to be definitively proven. On a lighter note, one interesting pattern I noticed is that some of the cases I covered are somehow connected to Doctor Who. There's a 2011 episode titled A Good Man Goes to War, where it's implied a lizard woman ate Jack the Ripper.
Send a telegram to Inspector Eilean of the Yard. Jack the Ripper has claimed his last victim.
How did you find him?
Stringy, but tasty all the same.
There's an old episode from the 60s where the Daleks go back in time and attack the crew of the Mary Celeste, prompting the crew to jump overboard, which is the episode's way of explaining the mystery. The disappearance of the Eilean Lighthouse keepers inspired the 1970s serial The Horror of Fang Rock, and it was a rerun of this episode that was interrupted by the Max Headroom hijacking. I guess this isn't that important of a detail, but I thought it was a fun little thing to bring up regardless. But, to bring things back on track, the last pattern I noticed is that all of these cases I covered took place before the 21st century. The oldest case on this list is Roanoke Colony, which originated in 1590, and the youngest is the Max Headroom Incident, which took place in 1987. Given the modern innovation of the internet and the fact that forensic science is as advanced as it is, I think it's safe to assume that most of these cases would be solved if they took place today. Now, the D.B. Cooper and Max Headroom hijackings couldn't happen today, as now we have laws and regulations that would make it unlikely for these incidents to happen again, but the same can't be said for the rest of the cases. If Jack the Ripper murdered prostitutes in London today, he would no doubt be caught. If John White, separated from his family, returned to England today, he would still have contact with his family via the internet, meaning they would never go missing. The only two I'm more iffy on is the Mary Celeste and the Eilean Lighthouse keepers, as given the circumstances, I suppose it's still possible for them to end up as unsolved mysteries even if they did happen today, but it's just as likely that they would have been solved thanks to modern technology. I guess all this is to say that thanks to modern knowledge and technology, unsolved mysteries are becoming a thing of the past. They can still happen, but not as frequently as they used to. And another thing to consider is that modern knowledge and technology can be used to solve some of these old unsolved mysteries. There may come a day when every single case mentioned in this video gets a definitive answer without some air of doubt to them. But until such time comes, these mysteries will remain unsolved.